Meet David, a talented software engineer who spent 3 months planning the perfect app, but never wrote a single line of code. David sat in his favorite coffee shop, surrounded by notebooks filled with detailed sketches, flowcharts, and feature lists for his dream app. He'd researched every possible programming framework, analyzed dozens of competitor apps, and created what he believed was a flawless development plan. His friends were impressed by his thoroughness and attention to detail. There was just one problem. After 3 months of preparation, he still hadn't started building anything. "I need to make sure I have everything figured out before I begin," David would tell himself each morning as he opened yet another planning document instead of his code editor. "If I'm going to do this, I need to do it right. There's no point in starting until I can guarantee it will be perfect." This wasn't David's first encounter with what he privately called his perfectionist curse. Throughout his life, he'd been praised for his high standards and meticulous attention to detail. Teachers loved his perfectly formatted reports, his managers appreciated his bug-free code, and his friends admired his ability to execute flawless dinner parties and vacation plans. David had built his entire identity around being the person who did things right the first time. But this strength had become a prison. David had spent years dreaming of launching his own app, starting a blog about programming, learning to play guitar, and even trying his hand at painting. Yet none of these dreams had materialized beyond the planning stage. Every time he got close to starting something new, his mind would flood with concerns about not being good enough, not being ready, not having all the necessary skills or knowledge. What if the app has bugs? He'd worry. What if people think my blog posts are stupid? What if I'm terrible at guitar and embarrass myself? What if my paintings look like a child made them? These thoughts would paralyze him, leading to more research, more planning, and more delay. The irony wasn't lost on David that he was excellent at his day job, where he confidently tackled complex programming challenges and delivered high-quality solutions under tight deadlines. But at work, he wasn't starting from scratch. He was building on existing systems, using familiar tools, and working within established frameworks. Personal projects felt different, scarier, more exposing. The breaking point came during a conversation with his colleague Lisa, who had just launched her own side project, a simple productivity app that had gained a modest but enthusiastic user base. David congratulated her while secretly feeling a mixture of admiration and frustration. Lisa's app wasn't revolutionary or perfect, but it was real, it was helping people, and it existed in the world rather than just in someone's imagination. "How did you get started?" David asked, genuinely curious. "Did you have everything planned out beforehand?" Lisa laughed. "Are you kidding? I had a basic idea and just started coding. The first version was pretty rough. I'm actually embarrassed by some of the early code now. But users started giving me feedback and I kept improving it. I probably learned more in the first month after launching than I had in the previous year of thinking about maybe starting a project someday." David felt that familiar, uncomfortable twinge in his stomach. "But weren't you worried about releasing something that wasn't polished?" "Sure, I was nervous," Lisa admitted. "But I realized that my fear of releasing something imperfect was actually preventing me from releasing anything at all. I started thinking about it differently. Instead of trying to avoid all mistakes, I decided to make mistakes quickly and learn from them." That evening, David couldn't stop thinking about Lisa's words. He called his friend Emma, who was pursuing a PhD in psychology, and shared his frustration about being stuck in endless planning cycles. "You know," Emma said thoughtfully, "what you're describing sounds like a specific type of perfectionism that psychologists call paralysis perfectionism, or sometimes procrastination perfectionism. It's different from the functional perfectionism that makes you good at your job." Emma explained that researchers had identified different types of perfectionism. There's adaptive perfectionism, which drives high standards and quality work, and there's maladaptive perfectionism, which can actually prevent you from starting or completing tasks because the fear of imperfection becomes overwhelming. She told David about Dr. Brené Brown's research on perfectionism and vulnerability. Brown defines perfectionism as a self-destructive and addictive belief system that fuels this primary thought. If I look perfect, live perfectly, and do everything perfectly, I can avoid or minimize the painful feelings of shame, judgment, and blame. This definition hit David like a lightning bolt. He realized that his perfectionism wasn't really about high standards, it was about protection. By refusing to start anything unless he could guarantee perfection, he was protecting himself from the possibility of criticism, failure, or the discovery that he might not be as competent as he hoped. The cruel irony, Emma continued, is that perfectionism actually prevents you from achieving excellence? Excellence comes from practice, experimentation, and learning from mistakes. Perfectionism prevents all of those things. Emma shared more insights from psychological research. She explained the concept of fear of negative evaluation, the anxiety about being judged or criticized by others, which often underlies perfectionist tendencies. She also mentioned imposter syndrome, the persistent feeling that you're not as competent as others perceive you to be, despite evidence of your abilities. There's also something called all-or-nothing thinking, Emma added. Perfectionists often see only two options: perfect success or complete failure. They don't recognize the vast middle ground where most learning and growth actually happens. David recognized all of these patterns in himself. He'd been so focused on avoiding the possibility of creating something mediocre that he'd been creating nothing at all. His 100-point standard had become a barrier that prevented him from even attempting the 60-point efforts that could have led to genuine learning and improvement. So what do I do about it? David asked, feeling both enlightened and overwhelmed. Emma suggested starting with what psychologists call behavioral experiments, small, low-stakes attempts to test the validity of his perfectionist beliefs. Instead of trying to overcome perfectionism all at once, you could start with tiny experiments that help you gather evidence about what actually happens when you do something imperfectly. She recommended beginning with what she called strategic imperfection, deliberately doing things at 70% quality instead of 100%, just to see what happened. The goal isn't to become okay with mediocrity, Emma clarified. It's to learn that imperfection isn't as catastrophic as your mind predicts it will be. Emma also introduced David to the concept of growth mindset versus fixed mindset, based on the research of psychologist Carol Dweck. People with a fixed mindset believe their abilities are static. Either you're good at something or you're not. People with a growth mindset believe abilities can be developed through effort and learning. Perfectionism often stems from a fixed mindset, the belief that if you're not immediately good at something, it means you're not capable of becoming good at it. Over the next few days, David reflected on these insights and decided to conduct his first behavioral experiment. Instead of continuing to plan his perfect app, he would spend exactly 1 week building the simplest possible version of his core idea, what developers call a minimum viable product, or MVP. The first day was agonizing. Every line of code David wrote felt clunky and amateurish compared to his grand vision. His perfectionist mind generated a constant stream of criticism. This design is terrible. This code is inefficient. Users will think this is pathetic, but instead of stopping, David wrote down these thoughts in a notebook and kept coding. By the third day, something interesting happened. David began to see his imperfect code not as a failure, but as a starting point. He started thinking about improvements he could make, features he could add, and ways to make the user experience better. Instead of being paralyzed by imperfection, he was energized by possibility. At the end of the week, David had a functioning app. It was simple, rough around the edges, and missing many features from his original vision. But it worked. Users could download it, use it, and provide feedback. Most importantly, it existed in the world rather than just in his imagination. David decided to share his imperfect app with a small group of friends and colleagues, asking for honest feedback. To his surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Not because the app was perfect, but because it solved a real problem in a simple, accessible way. "I love how straightforward it is," one friend commented. "So many apps try to do everything and end up being confusing. This just does one thing really well." Even more surprising to David were the constructive suggestions he received. Instead of the harsh criticism he'd feared, people offered thoughtful ideas for improvements, feature requests, and insights about user experience. These conversations gave him more valuable direction for his project than months of solo planning had provided. "The feedback isn't scary," David told Emma during their next conversation. "It's actually exciting. People are engaging with something I created, and they're helping me make it better. I feel like I'm finally having real conversations about my work instead of just imaginary arguments with imaginary critics." Emma smiled knowingly. That's the difference between perfectionism and excellence. Perfectionism is about avoiding criticism. Excellence is about using feedback to improve. When you're not afraid of imperfection, you can actually engage with the process of getting better. Over the following months, David continued releasing updates to his app, each one better than the last. He also started the programming blog he'd been planning for years, beginning with a post about his experience overcoming perfectionist paralysis. The blog wasn't literary genius, but it was honest and helpful. and it gradually built a small but engaged readership. Most surprisingly, David found that embracing imperfection had made him better at everything, not worse. At work, he became more innovative and willing to suggest creative solutions. His code became more elegant because he was willing to write messy first drafts and then refine them. His relationships improved because he stopped trying to be the perfect friend and became more authentic and vulnerable. I used to think that my perfectionism was what made me good at my job, David reflected. But I realized that I was good at my job despite my perfectionism, not because of it. When I stopped being afraid of making mistakes, I became more creative, more productive, and honestly, happier. The most profound change was psychological. David no longer saw mistakes as evidence of inadequacy, but as information that helped him improve. He developed what psychologists call mistake resilience, the ability to bounce back from errors without damage to self-esteem. 6 months after launching his Imperfect app, David received an email that changed his perspective entirely. A user wrote to thank him for creating the app, explaining how it had helped them organize their life during a difficult personal transition. The user mentioned specific features they appreciated and suggested improvements for future versions. Reading that email, I realized something profound, David told Lisa during a coffee meeting. If I had waited until the app was perfect, this person would never have gotten the help they needed. My perfectionism wasn't just hurting me, it was potentially preventing me from helping others. David had discovered what researchers call the perfectionism paradox, the counterintuitive truth that pursuing perfection often prevents us from achieving excellence. By demanding 100% from himself before starting, he'd been unable to reach even 60%. By accepting 70% as a starting point, he'd eventually created something closer to 90%. His journey had taught him to distinguish between good enough to start and good enough to finish. Most projects needed to be good enough to start at around 60 to 70% quality, but they could only reach 90 to 95% quality through iteration, feedback, and continuous improvement. The hardest lesson, David explained to a colleague who was struggling with similar perfectionist tendencies, was learning that done is better than perfect, not because mediocrity is the goal, but because done is the only way to get feedback, learn, and actually improve. David also learned about what psychologists call self-compassion, treating himself with the same kindness he would show a good friend facing similar challenges. Instead of harsh self-criticism when things didn't go perfectly, he practiced supportive self-talk. This is hard, and it's normal to struggle when learning something new. What can I learn from this experience? The transformation had ripple effects throughout David's life. He started learning guitar, accepting that he would sound terrible at first and gradually improve. He took up painting as a hobby, creating imperfect but personally meaningful artwork. He even started dating again after years of avoiding relationships because he felt he wasn't perfect enough to be worthy of love. Perfectionism had convinced me that I needed to be flawless to be valuable, David realized. But life isn't about being flawless. It's about growing, contributing, and connecting with others. All of those things require accepting imperfection as part of the human experience. A year after his initial breakthrough, David was invited to speak at a local meetup about overcoming creative blocks. As he prepared his presentation, he reflected on how much his relationship with perfectionism had evolved. I still have high standards, he told the audience. But now they're standards that motivate me rather than paralyze me. I've learned that excellence is a process, not a destination. It's about continuous improvement, not initial perfection. David's story illustrates a common psychological trap that affects many high-achieving individuals. Perfectionism can be both a strength and a weakness, depending on how it's applied. Functional perfectionism drives quality and attention to detail, while dysfunctional perfectionism creates paralysis and prevents progress. The fear of creating something imperfect often prevents us from creating anything at all. This pattern is particularly common among people who have been praised for their high standards throughout their lives, leading them to believe that their worth is dependent on flawless performance. Research in psychology shows that perfectionism often stems from deeper fears: fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear of discovering our limitations, or fear of not living up to others' expectations. Understanding these underlying fears can help us address perfectionism at its root rather than just fighting its symptoms. The concept of good enough doesn't mean accepting mediocrity. It means recognizing that perfection is often the enemy of progress. Most achievements in life come from starting imperfectly and improving iteratively, rather than waiting until we're ready to perform flawlessly. Psychologists distinguish between adaptive perfectionism, high standards that motivate excellence, and maladaptive perfectionism, impossible standards that create paralysis. Learning to recognize the difference can help us harness the positive aspects of perfectionism while avoiding its destructive effects. The growth mindset concept suggests that abilities can be developed through effort, strategy, and learning from mistakes. This perspective makes imperfection less threatening because it's seen as part of the learning process rather than evidence of inadequacy. Remember, these are general insights from psychology, and everyone's experience is unique. Some people benefit from high standards, while others find that perfectionism significantly impacts their mental health and productivity. The key is honest self-reflection about whether your standards are helping you grow or holding you back. If you find yourself stuck in planning or preparation phases, afraid to start because you can't guarantee perfect results, consider experimenting with strategic imperfection. Set a lower bar for getting started, perhaps 70% instead of 100%, and see what you can learn from taking action despite uncertainty. The goal isn't to become comfortable with poor quality work, but to become comfortable with the discomfort of imperfection as a necessary step toward excellence. Most of the time, starting imperfectly leads to better outcomes than not starting at all. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this little story and the insights it brought.